Let's take a look at what SolidWorks calls top-down design and some of those same techniques in Creo Parametric. Here I have a part model open. I'm going to use File and then make Assembly from Part just to get an assembly open. And we can just left click to drop the component anywhere. There you can see it in the Feature Design Manager tree. Sorry if I mangled that name. The F in parentheses indicates that this component is fixed, but here I am in an assembly. There are three different methods that SolidWorks uses for top-down design. First, creating individual features in a model inside of an assembly, creating complete parts inside of the assembly and complete subassemblies as well. And the third method is creating an entire assembly using a top-down approach with a layout sketch. In this video, we will take a look at the first two methods that SolidWorks uses for top-down design. Before I do that though, let's take a look at a couple different options. I will go to the options icon in the ribbon, and here we have the system options dialog box. The first control that I will go to is underneath assemblies, and if we take a look in here, we have an option to save new components to external files. So here you can see that it is unchecked. If I create a new part or a new subassembly while I'm in the assembly, by default, it's going to be what's called a virtual component. It will be a part or an assembly, but it will not have its own separate file unless I choose to make it an external file. The second option to take a look at in here is underneath display, and we have this assembly transparency for in-context editing. There is a slider bar for the amount of transparency. You can see it's far over to the right, probably around 80% or so. I personally prefer it to be much lower, so I'm going to slide it over to the left. Let's click the OK button. And now let's start creating some different components inside of the assembly. To do that, we have the Insert Components drop down, and from here I can also create new parts and new assemblies. Let's create our first new part, and you can see that the icon changes so that there is a green check mark next to it. But if you move your mouse over different surfaces, the icon changes to indicate that when you are dropping this new component that you're creating inside of the assembly, it's going to end up attached to that particular reference. Let me left click on this particular surface, and right now I am in Edit Component, and if you take a look in the tree, you can see that we have the new part created, and the name is in brackets, and it's got the little up arrow pointing to assembly 3, and that way you can see how it looks. Also, it is highlighted in blue because it is the active component. So I can start creating geometry in this feature. If I expand the mates folder, by selecting that surface, we got something called an in-place mate, and this is all that's necessary in order to locate this newly created component inside of the assembly. And so let's create some different entities just to get some geometry. I want to point out that there is a button in the ribbon to prevent the creation of external references when you create or edit features in context. So when I'm working on a part model in an assembly, that's called in context editing. Whereas if I were to open up the component, the part, in its own separate window, that would be editing it in isolation. And so to create some entities real quick, let's go to Convert Entities, and I will select this face from the part to convert. Let's hit the check mark, and so now I have a sketch created. Let's hit the check mark or get out of sketch mode, and let's then go to the Features tab, and I will create an extruded boss or base, and let's select the sketch, and then We can drag this out to some depth. Let me use a depth of 25. That's good, and hit the check mark. And so in that way, we have used that sketch based on the entities from the assembly, the component in the assembly, in order to make our geometry. And so now that, let's say that I'm done creating the geometry in this particular model, by clicking on the edit component icon, I'm disabling that edit component. You'll notice the component goes back to the regular normal black color that all the other objects in the Design Manager look like. All right, so that's one way. Let's take a look at another way of creating a part in here. So again, I'll go to the drop down and then choose new part. And for locating this new part, I'm just going to click in empty space. And so here we have part 8 created. And again, it's got the F in parentheses. By using this one, it ends up locating the component at the origin of the assembly. And if I want to start working on this particular part, I can click on it and then choose edit component. You'll notice that the other components went a little more transparent. By default, it will go more transparent than that, but I changed that setting at the beginning of this video. So now let's take a look at creating geometry in this model. And I'm going to choose to sketch on the datum plane called right. And let's once again convert entities. And I'm just going to grab a couple edges in here. And then let's hit the check mark. And so now we have a sketch created in the middle of the assembly at the location where the right plane is. And I'm happy with that. Let's exit out of the sketch. And now I'm going to click on the Features tab. Let's extrude another boss or base. And let's flip the direction of the feature. And I could drag it out if I could grab the handle, but I don't even want a blind depth. I'm going to use another reference from the assembly. Let's choose up to surface. Now I'll choose this particular surface from the original part so you can see how it's driving the depth. Let's hit the check mark. And so in this way, I have created two different parts in the assembly, and I've created features in those parts in the assembly. Let's take a look at some other stuff. I'm going to unclick edit component so that we're back to essentially the top level assembly. And let me collapse these different objects in the tree. And for the next one, let's create a subassembly. I'll go to the drop down menu and then let's choose new assembly. And so now we have an assembly, but in this particular situation, there is a minus sign in parentheses. I didn't have to drop it anywhere in the graphics area or on a surface in the model. It just automatically created that assembly, and it doesn't locate it. It doesn't define any mates for it. Let's say I decide that I want to edit this particular assembly. I will click on it and then I can choose to edit the component. And by the way, you can get to that command from the toolbar that opens up. And once again, it changes to the blue color. When I have this particular component, this subassembly being edited, if I go to create a brand new part, well, let's just click on the screen in order to locate it. And so there we have the part located in here. And now let's get out of editing the component. If I want this assembly to be located now, I can create some mates. So let's go to the mate command. And here we get the mates folder. Let me expand the tree in the middle of the graphics area just because it makes it a lot easier for me to select stuff. Let's select the origin from the subassembly. Let's select the origin from the top level. And right now it's coincident. It's going to align axes. All this looks good. Let's hit the check mark to add or finish the mate. And I don't want any other mates in here, so let's hit that check mark. And so now that subassembly that I created in the assembly no longer has the minus sign in parentheses next to it. So again, here's how we created parts and a subassembly, and even a part in a subassembly in the context of the assembly. So that, in conjunction with creating features in some of the parts, are two of the methods of top-down design in SolidWorks. Let's take a look at doing this stuff in Creo Parametric. Here I am in Creo Parametric. I have the part open. Let's create our brand new assembly. I will change the radio button, and let's leave the file name and use our default template. Let's bring in that first component. I will click on the assemble button. Let me go to in session to grab the part from my computer's RAM. To locate it at the origin, I can right mouse click and choose default constraint, and then hit the check mark or middle mouse button to locate that first component. Now let's say I want to create some components in the context of the assembly. I can do that by clicking on the create button, and right now part is selected and we are using the solid subtype. I will leave the file name the same and then click OK, and we get a creation options dialog box. I will copy from the default template and click OK. And for the first component, let me turn on my datum plane display. In SolidWorks, I had selected a flat surface from the model in the assembly in order to create that in-place constraint. Well, it's a little different in Creo Parametric. If I want to create the constraints, I can pick the flat surface and then pick the corresponding datum plane. And let's add in another constraint for this plane and this plane, and then create one more. Let's create a new constraint for, let's say, this plane, and let me grab this plane from the part. I am fully constrained, so I can hit the check mark or the middle mouse button. So that way we control the location of the default datums in the new part. But if I just want to locate it at the origin, I'll hit the create button, and let's click OK out of the create component dialog box, OK out of creation options, and then I can right mouse click and hold and choose default constraint, and then hit the check mark or middle mouse button to locate that one. Already my screen is getting a little cluttered. Let's just turn off the display of our datum planes entirely. And if I want to start creating features in one of those parts, all I need to do is select it, and then from the mini toolbar we have the activate icon. Now, based on the default settings in Creo Parametric, it will dim all the other components in the assembly, but I have that option turned off. If you take a look at the bottom of the screen, it tells us the active part is the first part that I created. So now if I want to create geometry in this part, I could create a sketch and then pick the surface that I want to sketch on. And I'm doing this, although this is not the recommended technique. I selected a surface from another part. That creates a direct external reference. You really should not be doing that. Also, another thing that you can do, which is not recommended, you can use the project command in order to select a bunch of different edges. This is just like the similar command in SolidWorks. Here I've got the loop that I want. Let's then hit the check mark to get out of sketch mode, and then I can choose to extrude that. Let's change the depth. Previously I used a value of 25. Let's use the same value over there. So in this manner, I have created features in the part, and this isn't really top-down design in Creo Parametric. This is just designing with external references. And again, I used a bunch of techniques that are not recommended. So the way that you do things in SolidWorks, not really a great way of doing things in Creo Parametric. Really what I should be doing is using data sharing features like a copy geometry feature, or maybe a shrink wrap feature, or a merge inheritance feature to get the geometry that I want, because that gives me additional controls over my dependencies. But that is a topic for another video. Let's activate the other part, and similar to what I did in SolidWorks, let me turn on my plane display once more. I just want to figure out which plane that I want to use for sketching. I think it's the datum plane called right. So let's create a sketch on that surface. And let me turn off my plane display because it is cluttering the screen. Let's use the project command and just grab a couple of those edges. And let's close out and hit the check mark. And then with that sketch still selected, I will choose to do an extrude. And let me move this to the middle of the screen. We've got the drag handle. I can drag it in the other direction. If I hold down the shift key while I'm dragging, I have trouble getting the surface. Let me zoom in a little bit more. If I hold down the shift key while dragging, I can use that as a shortcut method to get to the to reference depth option. Let's hit the check mark in order to complete the feature. So again, that's a method that you can use, although it is not recommended in the Creo Parametric side. Also, similar to what we did inside of SolidWorks, let me activate the top level assembly. I can choose to create a new subassembly and click OK and OK. And let's locate it at the default constraint. And then I can activate that subassembly, and then I can create a new part inside of that subassembly. Okay, okay. And let's use the default constraint once more, and then check mark or middle mouse button. So creating components inside of an assembly is often done as part of top-down design, whereby you are going to define the product structure of your assembly. And yes, you can create features inside of those parts in assembly mode, but it's just, really just designing with external references. So that's how you can accomplish those same two tasks that we saw in SolidWorks inside of Creo Parametric. I hope you enjoyed this video. For more information, please visit www.creowindshield.com. If you learned something from this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you like this video, please click the subscribe button and ring the bell to be informed when new videos are uploaded. Thank you very much.